The letter had been sitting in a dusty box for 40 years. For 4 decades. It waited in silence while a man lived an entire life without knowing what it contained. And when 71-year-old Thomas Walker finally opened it, everything he believed about his past changed in less than a minute. The rain tapped softly against the windows of Thomas's small house in Ohio. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon. The kind of afternoon that felt longer than it should. The kind that reminded a man how empty a house could become after enough years. Thomas sat alone at the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 3 years earlier. His daughter lived in Arizona with her own family. His son called when he could, but life was busy. Most days, Thomas kept himself occupied with small routines. Morning walks, grocery trips, watching old baseball games. Anything to keep the silence from feeling too heavy. That afternoon, he was cleaning the attic. The doctor had recently warned him that climbing stairs wasn't getting any easier at his age. But Thomas ignored the advice. He wasn't ready to become the kind of old man who sat still, waiting for time to pass. The attic was filled with decades of forgotten memories. Old Christmas decorations, photo albums, boxes Margaret had labeled years ago. As he sorted through them, he found a faded cardboard box tucked behind an old bookshelf. He didn't recognize it. A layer of dust covered the lid. Curious, he pulled it closer and opened it. Inside were college notebooks, photographs, and yellowed papers from another lifetime. A lifetime he rarely thought about anymore. Back when he was young. Back when everything seemed possible. Back before responsibilities, mortgages, and years of routine slowly shaped him into someone different. Thomas smiled as he flipped through the contents. Then he froze. At the bottom of the box was an envelope. His name was written across the front. Not printed. Handwritten. The moment he saw the handwriting, something tightened inside his chest. He recognized it instantly. Emily Carter. He hadn't seen that name in over 40 years. For a moment, he simply stared. His hands trembled. Emily? The woman he once believed he would marry. The woman who disappeared from his life almost overnight. The woman he had spent years trying to forget. Thomas lowered himself onto an old chair. Memories came rushing back. He was 29 when he met Emily. She was bright, funny, and fearless. The kind of person who made every room feel warmer. They spent 2 years together. 2 years building dreams. Talking about the future. Talking about marriage. Talking about the family they hoped to have someday. Then, everything fell apart. A job opportunity took Thomas across the country. Emily wanted him to stay. Thomas chose the job. At the time, it seemed practical, responsible, the smart choice. They promised to make the relationship work. For a few months, they exchanged letters. Then the letters became less frequent. The phone calls became shorter. One day, they stopped completely. Thomas never fully understood why. Years later, he heard from a mutual friend that Emily had moved away. Eventually, life moved on. Or at least that's what he told himself. Now her handwriting sat in his hands again. After 40 years, his heart pounded. The envelope had never been opened. The seal remained intact. How was that possible? How had he never seen it before? Thomas turned it over. A faded postmark showed a date. 40 years ago. The letter had somehow ended up inside this forgotten box. And stayed hidden all this time. He swallowed hard. Part of him wanted to leave it unopened. Some memories were better left alone. Some doors didn't need reopening. But another part of him, the part that still remembered Emily's laugh, needed answers. Needed to know. With trembling fingers, he carefully broke the seal. A folded letter slid out. Several pages. He unfolded the first page. The paper was fragile with age. The words had faded slightly, but they were still readable. As he began reading, his expression changed. Confusion, shock, disbelief, then something else. Fear, real fear. His breathing became uneven. His eyes raced across the page, again and again, as if refusing to believe what he was seeing. The letter wasn't simply a goodbye. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a final message from a lost love. It was something far bigger. Something that could have changed the course of his entire life. Near the bottom of the second page, one sentence stopped him cold. Thomas felt the room spin around him. His hands shook so badly the paper nearly slipped from his grasp. For 40 years, He had lived without knowing the truth. And according to the words written in Emily's letter, he had a son. A son he had never met. A son who had no idea his father was still alive. And the final line of the letter made the discovery even more devastating. Because Emily had written that she was leaving town forever, and she had taken the boy with her. Thomas stared at the page in stunned silence. Then he noticed something tucked behind the last sheet. A photograph. One he hadn't seen before. Slowly he pulled it free. The picture showed Emily standing beside a teenage boy. And the moment Thomas saw the boy's face, his blood ran cold. Because the boy looked exactly like him. And written on the back of the photograph were 5 words that changed everything. His name is Daniel. Find him. Thomas couldn't move. The photograph remained frozen in his trembling hands, while the rain continued tapping against the windows. The teenage boy in the picture had his eyes. Not similar eyes. Not eyes that vaguely resembled his. The exact same eyes. The same shape. The same serious expression. Even the slight tilt of his head looked familiar. It was like staring at an old photograph of himself. Only this boy wasn't him. This boy was Daniel, his son. A son he never knew existed. For several minutes, Thomas sat in complete silence. His heart felt heavy. Not because of what he'd discovered, because of what he'd lost. 40 years. 40 years of birthdays. 40 years of Christmas mornings. 40 years of scraped knees, graduations, first jobs, heartbreaks, victories, failures, and memories. Gone. Not because he chose to abandon his child, because he never knew the child existed. The realization hit him harder than anything else. All those years, he had occasionally wondered what happened to Emily. Had she married? Had she been happy? Had life treated her well? Never once had he imagined she had been carrying his child when she disappeared. Thomas looked back at the letter. His eyes moved slowly across the faded pages. This time, he read every word carefully. Emily explained everything. She had discovered she was pregnant shortly after Thomas moved away for work. At first, she intended to tell him immediately. Then tragedy struck. Thomas's father suffered a serious illness during that same period. Emily had heard about it through mutual friends. She knew Thomas was overwhelmed. She didn't want to add more pressure to his life. Weeks became months. Months became fear. The longer she waited, the harder it became to explain. Then another opportunity appeared. A relative offered her a fresh start in another state. Emily made a decision she would spend years questioning. She wrote the letter. She mailed it. Then she left. The letter should have reached Thomas. But somehow it never did. Lost. Misplaced. Forgotten. Hidden inside a box, where nobody would find it for 4 decades. One small accident. One missing letter. And an entire life changed. Thomas lowered his head into his hands. The weight of that truth was unbearable. If he had received this letter, everything would have been different. Maybe he would have gone after Emily. Maybe they would have raised Daniel together. Maybe they would have become a family. Maybe Margaret would never have entered his life. Maybe his daughter and son would never have been born. The possibilities twisted inside his mind. A lifetime built on one missing piece of paper. His eyes drifted toward the final paragraph. The words were difficult to read through the tears gathering in his eyes. If you're reading this, I hope you'll find us. Daniel deserves to know who his father is. No matter what happens between you and me, he deserves that. Thomas closed his eyes. She had trusted him. She had given him the chance. And fate had stolen it. That night, Thomas barely slept. He sat in his recliner until dawn, staring at the photograph. The older he got, the more he believed life eventually revealed all its secrets. But this secret felt cruel. At 71, most people were looking backward. Thomas suddenly felt as though his life had been split into 2 chapters. The life before the letter, and the life after it. By morning, he had made a decision. He had to find Daniel. Even if it was impossible. Even if Daniel wanted nothing to do with him. Even if he was too late. He needed answers. More importantly, Daniel deserved them too. The search began with the internet. Thomas wasn't particularly good with technology. His granddaughter usually helped him with anything involving computers. But for 3 straight days, he searched every name, every public record, every social media platform he could find. Daniel Carter. Daniel Walker, Daniel Carter Walker. Hundreds of results appeared. None seemed right. The photograph offered few clues. The letter mentioned only one city, Portland, Oregon. But that was 40 years ago. People moved. People changed names. People disappeared. The trail was cold. Very cold. Still, Thomas refused to quit. For the first time in years, he felt driven by something bigger than himself. Every morning, he woke with purpose. Every night, he ended exhausted. And every day, the mystery grew. A week later, he visited an old friend named Frank. Frank had retired from law enforcement years ago. If anyone knew how to track people down, it was him. After hearing the story, Frank sat silently for a long time. Finally, he shook his head. "Tom, this might be the saddest thing I've ever heard." Thomas nodded. "I know. You understand what could happen, right?" "What do you mean?" Frank leaned forward. "Maybe he doesn't know about you." Thomas swallowed. "I figured that. Maybe Emily never told him." The thought struck like a hammer. Thomas had been so focused on finding Daniel that he hadn't fully considered that possibility. What if Daniel spent his entire life believing someone else was his father? What if revealing the truth destroyed everything? Frank continued. "Or maybe he knows." Thomas looked up. "And?" Frank sighed. "And maybe he spent 40 years wondering why you never came." The room fell silent. That possibility hurt even more, because if Daniel knew about him, then Daniel had probably spent decades believing his father chose not to be there. That his father didn't care. That his father abandoned him. Thomas felt sick. 3 weeks later, Frank called. His voice sounded different. Serious. Careful. "Tom, what is it?" "I found something." Thomas stood immediately, his heart racing. "What did you find?" Frank hesitated, long enough to make Thomas nervous. Then he spoke. "I found Daniel." Thomas nearly dropped the phone. For 40 years, Daniel had been missing from his life. Now, after only weeks of searching, he finally had an answer. But Frank didn't sound happy. Not at all. And before Thomas could ask why, Frank said something that made his stomach tighten. "There's something you need to know before you contact him." "What?" Another pause. A long one. Then Frank quietly said, "Your son has been searching for you too." Thomas gripped the phone so tightly, his knuckles turned white. For a moment, he thought he had misheard. "Say that again." Frank exhaled slowly. "Daniel has been searching for you." The words echoed through Thomas's mind. Searching for him. Not recently. Not casually. Frank explained that Daniel had spent years trying to uncover the identity of the father he'd for. Had sent. The discovery left Thomas speechless. For weeks, he had imagined every possible outcome. Daniel might hate him. Daniel might ignore him. Daniel might refuse to speak to him. But he had never imagined that somewhere out there, his son had been looking for him too. "How do you know?" Thomas finally asked. Frank shifted in his chair. "I found an online genealogy forum. Daniel posted there several years ago. He was looking for information about his biological father." Thomas felt his chest tighten. Did he find anything? No. The answer came quickly. He hit dead ends. Public records. Old addresses. A few people who remembered Emily. But nothing that led to you. Thomas lowered himself into a chair. The thought was heartbreaking. While he was living his life in Ohio, raising a family and building a career, his son had been asking questions no one could answer. Questions Thomas didn't even know existed. Who was my father? Why wasn't he here? Did he leave us? Did he ever think about me? Questions that now felt like knives. Frank eventually handed him a piece of paper, an address, a phone number, and a name. Daniel Carter, age 42, living outside Seattle, married, 2 children, a high school history teacher. Thomas stared at the information. 40 years of mystery, reduced to a few lines on a sheet of paper. His son was real, not just a photograph, not just a name in a letter. A real man with a real life, a wife, children, students, friends, memories. An entire world that existed without him. And now Thomas had a choice. Call, or stay silent. That night, sleep never came. He sat beside the kitchen window, with Emily's letter spread across the table. The moonlight illuminated the faded ink. For the first time in years, he spoke out loud to someone who wasn't there. "Emily, what am I supposed to do?" The empty room offered no answer. Only silence. The same silence that had existed for 40 years. Thomas looked at the photograph again. Emily looked young, hopeful. The boy beside her couldn't have been older than 14. Daniel's arm rested casually on her shoulder. They looked happy, but appearances could lie. Thomas wondered how difficult those years had been. How many sacrifices Emily had made. How many times she had wanted him there. The guilt became almost unbearable, even though none of it was truly his fault. The human heart didn't care about technicalities. It only cared about loss. And there was plenty of loss to go around. The next morning, Thomas picked up the phone, then put it down, then picked it up again, 3 times. Each attempt ended the same way. Fear. Not fear of rejection. Fear of causing damage. Daniel had a life, a family, a history. What right did Thomas have to suddenly appear and change everything? At 71, he understood something younger people often missed. Truth wasn't always simple. Sometimes truth healed. Sometimes truth hurt. Sometimes it did both. By lunchtime, he still hadn't called. By evening, he still hadn't called. The paper sat beside him untouched. Then his daughter called. Sarah. Without realizing it, Thomas told her everything. The letter, Emily, Daniel, the search, every painful detail. Sarah listened quietly. When he finished, there was silence on the line. Then she asked a question that changed everything. What if it were me? Thomas frowned. What do you mean? What if I spent my whole life wondering about someone important? Would you want me to know the truth? Thomas didn't answer, because he already knew the answer. Of course. Then maybe Daniel deserves the same thing. Tears filled his eyes. Sarah continued softly. Dad, you're not calling because you're afraid. Maybe. No. Definitely. A small smile crossed Thomas's face. His daughter knew him too well. You're afraid he'll hate you. Thomas swallowed. Yeah. And if he does? The question hung in the air. If he does, Sarah said gently, at least he'll be hating the real story instead of a lie. An hour later, Thomas dialed the number. His hands trembled. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then someone answered. Hello? A man's voice. Deep, calm, familiar, shockingly familiar. Thomas felt as though he were listening to a younger version of himself. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Daniel spoke again. Hello? Thomas opened his mouth. Nothing came out. 40 years of silence had built a wall inside him. A wall that suddenly seemed impossible to climb. Finally, he forced the words out. My name is Thomas Walker. Silence. Complete silence. Then, a sharp intake of breath. Daniel knew the name. Immediately. Thomas could feel it. Neither man spoke. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15. Then Daniel quietly asked, How did you find me? Thomas felt tears forming. I've been trying to find you. Another long pause. Then Daniel said something unexpected. Something that completely shattered every assumption Thomas had made. I stopped looking for you years ago. The words hit hard. But what came next hit harder. Because my mother told me you were dead. Thomas's heart stopped. Dead? Emily had told him he was dead? Why? Why would she do that? Nothing about the story made sense anymore. The letter. The search, the lies, the missing decades. Suddenly, there were more questions than answers. And before Thomas could ask any of them, Daniel spoke again, his voice shaking slightly. There are things about my mother you don't know. Thomas gripped the phone. What things? A long silence followed. Then Daniel whispered, She wasn't the person you thought she was. Thomas sat frozen. The phone pressed tightly against his ear. Outside, the rain had started again, tapping softly against the windows. But he barely heard it. His entire focus was on the man at the other end of the line. His son. The son he had never known. The son who had just told him something that made no sense. She wasn't the person you thought she was. Thomas struggled to find his voice. What do you mean? For several seconds, Daniel didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded distant. Careful, like someone opening a door he had kept locked for years. I loved my mother, Daniel said quietly. I still do. Thomas nodded even though Daniel couldn't see him. But loving someone and understanding them aren't always the same thing. A chill ran through Thomas. He looked at Emily's letter lying on the table. The faded handwriting. The desperate hope between every line. The woman he remembered had been kind, honest, compassionate. So why had she told their son his father was dead? Daniel took a slow breath. When I was growing up, Mom never talked about you. Thomas listened carefully. If I asked questions, she'd change the subject. Did she ever tell you my name? No. The answer came immediately. Not until I was almost 20. Thomas closed his eyes. 20 years. 20 years. Before Daniel even knew his father's name. The thought hurt. Daniel continued. When I was little, she told me my father died before I was born. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. I believed her. Of course you did. For years. The silence between them felt heavy. Then Daniel said something Thomas never expected. When I turned 18, I found an old photo. Thomas glanced down at the photograph beside him. The same one. Daniel explained that he had discovered a box hidden in a closet. Inside were old pictures, letters, and documents. Among them was a photograph of a young man standing beside Emily. Thomas. That's when I realized she'd lied. Thomas stared at the wall. Emily had hidden the truth. Not just from him. From Daniel too. But why? Over the next hour, pieces of a story slowly emerged. A story neither man had known. After moving away, Emily's life became much harder than Thomas had imagined. Money was tight. Support was limited. She worked multiple jobs, raised Daniel alone, struggled constantly. But according to Daniel, something changed over time. The loneliness became bitterness. The bitterness became resentment. And eventually, she stopped talking about Thomas altogether. Do you think she hated me? Thomas asked quietly. Daniel hesitated. I don't know. The answer felt honest. Painfully honest. Some days I thought she did. Thomas lowered his head. The possibility hurt more than he expected. Not because Emily might have hated him. Because she might have spent decades carrying anger he never knew existed. An anger built on misunderstandings. Missed chances. A letter that never arrived. A life that never happened. Then Daniel revealed something else. Something even more surprising. About 10 years before she died, she started changing. Thomas looked up. Changing how? She became quieter. Daniel's voice softened. More reflective. He paused. Regretful. The word hung in the air. Regretful. It felt strangely familiar. The entire story seemed built on regret. Regret for choices. Regret for silence. Regret for lost years. Daniel continued. Near the end of her life, she admitted something. Thomas leaned forward. His pulse quickening. What? She said she made a mistake. The room suddenly felt very still. A mistake. She said she should have told me the truth sooner. Thomas closed his eyes. For a moment, he imagined Emily sitting somewhere years earlier. Older. Tired. Looking back on her life. Realizing things she couldn't change. The same way he often did now. Did she ever talk about me? Thomas asked. Daniel was silent for several seconds. Then he said, yes. Thomas's heart skipped. What did she say? Daniel let out a small laugh. Not a happy laugh. A sad one. The strange thing is, he paused. The older she got, the kinder her stories became. Thomas frowned. What do you mean? When I was young, you were almost never mentioned. Daniel swallowed. But later, his voice cracked slightly. Later she talked about how much she loved you. Thomas felt tears forming. She did? Yes. The answer came softly. She said you made her laugh. Another tear rolled down Thomas's cheek. She said you were stubborn. Thomas smiled through the pain. That sounded accurate. And she said losing you was the greatest heartbreak of her life. Thomas covered his face with one hand. 40 years. 40 years lost. Not because of a lack of love, but because of silence. Misunderstanding. Fear. And one missing letter. As the conversation continued, something remarkable happened. The awkwardness slowly disappeared. The tension eased. Two strangers began finding pieces of each other. Daniel talked about teaching history. Thomas talked about his years working in construction management. Daniel described his children. Thomas described his grandchildren. They discovered similar habits, similar personalities, even similar senses of humor. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Life had separated them. But blood had connected them anyway. Then Daniel suddenly became quiet. Thomas noticed immediately. What is it? Daniel hesitated. There is one more thing. Thomas's stomach tightened. What? Another long silence. Then Daniel spoke. My daughter is getting married next month. Thomas smiled. That's wonderful. It is. But Daniel didn't sound happy. He sounded nervous. Almost emotional. Finally, he said, She's the reason I answered your call. Thomas frowned. I don't understand. Daniel took a shaky breath. 3 days ago, she asked me a question. What question? The answer came so softly. Thomas almost missed it. She asked why she never had a grandfather on my side of the family. Thomas felt his throat tighten. And? Daniel swallowed hard. And I didn't know what to tell her. The silence that followed felt enormous. Then Daniel said something that left Thomas speechless. Something he never expected to hear. My daughter wants to meet you. Thomas stopped breathing. For 71 years, he had believed his story was almost over. Now, somehow, a completely new chapter was beginning. But before he could respond, Daniel added one final sentence. A sentence that changed everything once again. There's just one problem. Thomas gripped the phone. What problem? Daniel's voice grew quiet. She doesn't know who you are yet. Thomas didn't sleep that night. After ending the call with Daniel, he sat alone in the living room, long after midnight. The house was quiet. But his mind wasn't. For 40 years, he had lived believing certain chapters of his life were closed forever. Now, in a matter of weeks, doors he never expected to open had swung wide. A son, a granddaughter, an entire family branch he never knew existed. And somehow, they were real. Not memories. Not possibilities. Real people waiting on the other side of tomorrow. Still, Daniel's last words lingered in his mind. She doesn't know who you are yet. Thomas understood why. How do you explain something like this? How do you tell a young woman that her grandfather isn't dead, missing, or imaginary? That he's a 71-year-old man, sitting hundreds of miles away, holding a letter that arrived 40 years too late? There was no easy way, no perfect way, only the truth. The following weeks passed quickly. Thomas and Daniel spoke almost every day. At first, the conversations were cautious. They discussed simple things. Work, family, sports, weather, the safe topics. But gradually, deeper conversations emerged. Daniel asked questions about his childhood. Thomas shared stories about growing up on a small farm. Daniel wanted to know whether he had inherited certain habits. Thomas laughed when he realized many of them matched. Both hated asking for help. Both worked too much. Both bottled up emotions until they became impossible to ignore. Some things, it seemed, traveled through generations without permission. Each conversation chipped away at 40 years of distance. And each conversation made Thomas realize how much he had missed. Not just Daniel's childhood, the chance to be present, to guide, to protect, to encourage. The ordinary moments that quietly become life's greatest treasures. One evening, Daniel finally called with news. She knows. Thomas immediately sat up. Your daughter? Yeah. His voice sounded nervous. Thomas felt nervous too. What did she say? A brief pause. Then Daniel laughed. The first truly happy laugh Thomas had heard from him. She thought I was joking. Thomas smiled. I probably would too. When she realized I was serious, she cried. Thomas's heart tightened. Cried? Not because she was upset. Daniel paused. Because she couldn't believe she'd or spent her whole life missing someone she never knew existed. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Daniel quietly said, She wants to meet you. The wedding was scheduled for the following month. Thomas had attended many weddings throughout his life. Friends, relatives, neighbors, but none had made him this nervous. As the date approached, he found himself worrying constantly. What if they didn't like him? What if he disappointed them? What if 40 years was simply too much time to overcome? At 71, he knew life wasn't a movie. Not every reunion ended perfectly. Not every wound healed completely. Some losses stayed with you forever. Still, he boarded the plane. Because some opportunities come only once. And this was one of them. Seattle greeted him with gray skies and cool air. Daniel had offered to meet him at the airport. As Thomas walked through the terminal, he spotted him almost immediately. Not because he recognized him, because he recognized himself. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Older now. Different life. Different experiences. But undeniably connected. For a moment, neither moved. 40 years stood between them. 40 years of unanswered questions. 40 years of absence. Then Daniel stepped forward and hugged him. Thomas closed his eyes. The emotion hit harder than he expected. This wasn't fixing the past. Nothing could do that. But it was ending the silence. And sometimes, that mattered just as much. The wedding took place 2 days later. It was small, beautiful, filled with laughter and family. The kind of gathering Thomas had always loved. Yet throughout the ceremony, his attention kept drifting toward a young woman sitting near the front. His granddaughter, Emma. She looked nothing like the photograph he'd imagined in his mind. She looked real, alive, part of him, and he still couldn't believe it. After the ceremony, Daniel finally walked her over. Thomas's heart pounded. Emma smiled nervously. He smiled back. Neither seemed sure how to begin. Finally she broke the silence. So. Thomas laughed softly. So. She shook her head. This is weird. That made both men laugh. A little. A lot. They laughed again. And suddenly the tension disappeared. Over the next hour, they talked. About family. About life. About regrets. About second chances. At one point, Emma asked a question that caught Thomas off guard. If you could change one thing, what would it be? He didn't answer immediately. The younger version of himself would have said many things. Mistakes. Missed opportunities. Bad decisions. But age had changed him. Finally, he smiled. I'd make sure people I love always know the truth. Emma looked thoughtful. Because of the letter? Thomas nodded. Because of the letter. Later that evening, as the reception began winding down, Daniel handed him something. A small envelope. Thomas stared at it. What is this? Daniel smiled. Something my mother left behind. Thomas carefully opened it. Inside was a note. A short one. Written in Emily's familiar handwriting. His chest tightened instantly. The note read, If life ever finds a way to bring you two together, tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I never stopped hoping. Thomas read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Tears filled his eyes. Not tears of anger. Not tears of grief. Tears of peace. For 40 years, he had carried questions. Now, at last, he had answers. Not perfect answers, but enough. Enough to understand. Enough to forgive. Enough to move forward. As the evening ended, Thomas stood outside beneath the fading sunset. His son joined him, then his granddaughter. 3 generations standing together. A family separated by time, reunited by truth. No one spoke for a while. They didn't need to. Some moments are too meaningful for words. Thomas looked toward the horizon and smiled. Life had taken 40 years to deliver a letter. But sometimes, even the longest journeys still find their way home. And standing there beside the family he never knew he had, Thomas finally understood something important. It's never too late to discover the people who were always meant to be part of your story.